Everyone's heard of the SOE, but almost no one really understands what it took to keep it alive. The agents, the networks, the resistance cells scattered across occupied France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Poland, Yugoslavia. They didn't survive on courage alone. They survived on communication. On a single fragile link between a person hiding in a farmhouse attic and a signals officer sitting in a converted English country house hundreds of miles away. That link was a radio, a compact, hand-built, battery-powered transmitter receiver, small enough to fit inside a suitcase. And if you've never stopped to think about how extraordinary that was, you're about to. Because the story of those radios isn't just a technical footnote in the history of the Second World War. It's the reason entire operations succeeded or failed. It's the reason drops happened or didn't. It's the reason men and women lived or died, and it is one of the most gripping, dangerous, most human stories to come out of any conflict in modern history. So if you're ready for something genuinely remarkable, stay with me. And if you find yourself wanting more stories like this one, hit subscribe right now. Because we go deep on this stuff every single time. Let's start at the beginning, because to understand why those suitcase radios mattered so much, you need to understand the situation they were born into. When France fell in June of 1940, it happened fast. Faster than almost anyone expected. The Wehrmacht rolled through the Ardennes, flanked the Allied lines, and within 6 weeks, the Third Republic had collapsed. Paris was occupied. A puppet government was installed at Vichy, and Britain suddenly found itself staring across the English Channel at a continent almost entirely under German control. Winston Churchill's response was characteristically aggressive. He didn't just want to defend Britain, he wanted to take the fight back into occupied Europe, immediately, by any means available. And since conventional military options were limited, he turned to something unconventional. In July 1940, he authorized the creation of the Special Operations Executive, the SOE. His instruction to its first directors was blunt and famous: set Europe ablaze. The idea was straightforward in principle and extraordinarily complicated in practice. You recruit agents, usually people with ties to occupied countries, people who speak the language without an accent, who know the geography, who can pass as locals. You train them, you drop them in by parachute or land them by boat, and then they go to work. Sabotage, intelligence gathering, building networks of local resistors, receiving weapons and supplies dropped from the air, organizing, agitating, preparing the ground for an eventual Allied return. But here is the fundamental problem that nobody in an armchair could fully appreciate. Once an agent was inside occupied Europe, they were essentially cut off. They couldn't use a telephone. They couldn't send a letter. They couldn't walk into a British consulate and report in. The only way to maintain contact with London was radio. And not just any radio. A radio small enough to hide. Small enough to carry on a bicycle, in a shopping basket, under a false floor in a vehicle, tucked inside a musical instrument case or a legitimate-looking suitcase. A radio that had to be invisible to the most aggressive, most technically sophisticated counterintelligence apparatus in the world, the German Signals Security Services. This was the challenge, and the engineers who built the sets, the agents who carried them, and the radio operators who tapped out messages in Morse while German direction-finding vans circled outside, they were all part of the same impossible, brilliant, and desperately dangerous story. Let's talk about the radios themselves first, because they were remarkable pieces of engineering for their time. The SOE didn't start with a unified standard radio design. In the early days, agents were sometimes sent with commercially available wireless equipment or adapted military sets, none of which were ideal. They were too large, too heavy, too conspicuous, and often not well suited to clandestine work. There was also a security dimension. A standard military radio looks like exactly what it is. The Germans knew what British military communications equipment looked like. Finding one on a suspect confirmed everything instantly. So the SOE's signals branch, working alongside the Special Communications Unit and various independent engineers and workshops, set about designing something purpose-built. The result was a series of increasingly refined sets that became the backbone of SOE communications throughout the war. The most iconic of these was the Type A Mark III, often called the AMOC III. This was a compact transceiver, meaning it could both transmit and receive, contained within a small wooden box or leather case roughly the size of a large book. It weighed somewhere around 5 kilograms with its components, though the weight varied depending on configuration and the power supply carried alongside it. It operated on high-frequency bands, typically between 3 and 16 MHz, which was the range best suited to skipping signals across the ionosphere over the distances required to reach England from continental Europe. The set was designed to disassemble. The transmitter, the receiver, the power supply, the aerial equipment, and the headphones could be separated and distributed across multiple bags or hidden in different locations. An agent caught with one piece could plausibly claim innocence, at least in theory. In practice, the Germans were not naive, but the modularity added at least some margin of deniability. Later designs refined this concept even further. The B Mark II, introduced from 1942 onward, became the most widely used SOE field set of the war. It was slightly more powerful, more stable in frequency, and even more compact than its predecessors. Agents and signals planners both praised it for reliability in difficult conditions. It was built to tolerate rough handling, extreme temperatures, and the kind of abuse that inevitably came from being smuggled across borders in vehicles, thrown into haystacks, buried in gardens, and retrieved weeks later. Power was always a central problem. These radios needed electricity, and occupied Europe was not a place where you could simply plug into a convenient supply. Some sets were designed to work from local AC mains current, with adapters to handle different voltages across different countries, since France ran at different standards than the Netherlands or Poland. Others could run from batteries, including specially developed high-capacity dry cells. Some agents used hand-crank generators, small dynamos that a second person could operate while the wireless operator tapped out their message. Car batteries were another option when available. The ingenuity required to keep these sets powered was itself a significant logistical challenge, and running out of power at a critical moment was a very real operational risk. The aerial was another vulnerability. To transmit effectively over long distances, you needed an antenna of reasonable length, typically a wire of several meters stretched between 2 points at height. In a farmhouse, this might mean running a wire up through a trapdoor into the rafters. In an urban setting, it might mean draping a wire across a rooftop in a way that looked like washing line or telephone cable. Getting the aerial up and taking it down quickly was part of the drill. Every minute it was visible was a risk. And a fixed aerial, one that stayed up between transmission sessions, was almost suicidal by the later stages of the war. The operators themselves, the people who actually sat at these sets and transmitted, were among the most valuable and most endangered members of any SOE network. A wireless operator, or WT operator in the parlance of the time, required months of training before they were ready to operate in the field. They had to master Morse code to a high speed, typically 20 words per minute or better. They had to learn how to encode and decode messages using a cipher system. They had to understand radio propagation, know which frequencies worked best at different times of day and in different seasons, learn to tune the set quickly and accurately, and acquire the professional instincts to recognize when conditions were right for a transmission and when to wait. But technical skill was only part of it. The psychological demand was ferocious. A wireless operator in the field was always the most exposed member of the network, not because they necessarily carried weapons or moved around conspicuously, but because every time they pressed that Morse key, they were broadcasting their location. Radio waves do not respect walls, borders, or cover stories. They radiate in all directions, and the Germans were listening. The Germans had established an extensive signals interception and direction-finding network across all occupied territories. It went by various organizational names at different times, but the most feared element from the SOE's perspective was the Funkabwehr, the radio counterintelligence branch. These were dedicated, professional, and extremely capable people. Their job was to find clandestine transmitters, and they were very good at it. The Germans' direction-finding equipment was sophisticated. Fixed monitoring stations across the occupied territories could detect an unauthorized transmission and get a rough triangulation on its source within minutes of a broadcast beginning. Mobile direction-finding units, typically unmarked vans or cars, fitted with rotating loop antennas and receiver equipment, could then be deployed to narrow the location down dramatically. Given enough time on air, a skilled German DF team could pinpoint a transmitter to within a few city blocks. Given more time, they could get it to a single building, and once they had a building, the rest was house-to-house searching. This is why transmission schedules were so critical, and why SOE agents were drilled relentlessly on keeping their time on air to an absolute minimum. The basic rule of thumb that evolved through hard experience was this: never transmit for more than 15 to 20 minutes at a stretch. Many operators pushed this down to 10 minutes or less when the security situation felt dangerous. Some of the most experienced operators became famous within the organization for their ability to compress complex messages into astonishingly brief bursts of Morse, their fingers flying, their speed so high that the resulting transmission lasted only a few minutes before they were packing up the set. To understand the context of what those radios were actually communicating, you need to understand the supply drop system, because that is the other half of this story. The SOE's resistance networks in occupied Europe could not sustain themselves on goodwill and improvised weapons. To conduct serious sabotage operations, to arm local Maquis fighters, to prepare for a moment when they might be needed to actively support Allied advances, they needed materiel, explosives, weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, money in local currency, specialist equipment, forged documents, and all of this had to come from England. The primary mechanism for getting supplies into the field was the airdrop. Aircraft, typically Armstrong Whitworth Albemarles, Handley Page Halifaxes, Sterlings, and later American B-24 Liberators, would fly from airfields in Britain, or later from North Africa and Italy, to designated drop zones in occupied territory. There, they would release containers, cylindrical metal tubes packed with equipment, attached to parachutes, from low altitude in the dark of night. Simultaneously, small packages and sometimes additional agents would be parachuted from the same aircraft. Coordinating these drops required precise, reliable communication between the network on the ground and the SOE's headquarters at Baker Street in London, with the operational side funneled through the Air Operations Section and coordinated with the Royal Air Force's No. 138 Special Duty Squadron and No. 161 Squadron, the units specifically dedicated to SOE and SIS operations. The process worked like this. A network in the field identified a need, typically weapons or explosives, for a planned operation. The circuit organizer, often called a chef de réseau in the French context, would communicate this need to London through the wireless operator. London would assess the request against available resources, competing priorities, and aircraft availability, then authorize a drop and assign a date or window. The field network would select a drop zone, a field or clearing of adequate size, away from roads and habitations, with distinctive landmarks visible from the air. This location was encoded and transmitted back to London. On the night of the drop, the circuit would send a small reception committee to the field. These would be trusted local resistance members, typically farmers or people with plausible reasons to be in the countryside at night, armed with electric torches or sometimes lanterns. At the agreed hour, listening to the BBC's French or Dutch or Belgian service on their illegal wireless sets, they would hear a personal message, a phrase of apparent nonsense, something like, "The eagle has returned to its nest," or "Aunt Sophie is knitting again." These phrases were pre-agreed coded confirmations that the drop was proceeding as planned for that night. When the aircraft arrived, the reception committee would illuminate the drop zone in a prescribed pattern, typically an L shape or triangle of torches, indicating wind direction and the drop axis, while another member flashed a recognition letter in Morse on a torch directed at the aircraft. The pilot, seeing the correct pattern and signal, would make his low-level run and kick the containers out of the bomb bay or dispatch hatch. The reception committee would then have to move fast, collecting the containers, cutting away the parachutes, dragging everything to waiting vehicles or hidden caches before dawn came or German patrols appeared. Every single element of this process depended on the Suitcase radio. The initial request, the location report, the confirmation of the date, the fallback arrangements if weather canceled the drop, the post-drop confirmation that the supplies had been received safely. None of it happened without the wireless operator tapping out their encoded messages in an attic or cellar somewhere in occupied Europe, and the response being decoded on the other end. And here is where the stakes become breathtakingly clear. If the radio link broke, for any reason, the whole chain of events collapsed. A circuit that lost its wireless operator, whether through arrest, accident, or illness, was effectively blind to London. They couldn't receive drops. They couldn't request supplies for planned operations. They couldn't send intelligence. They couldn't call for help if things went wrong. They were on their own, in a hostile country, with whatever resources they already had, and no prospect of more until communication was restored. Restoring communication required either finding a new trained wireless operator, which was enormously difficult in the field, or getting a message to London through an alternative channel, perhaps through a courier route to neutral Spain or Switzerland, which took weeks or months. In the fast-moving operational environment of the resistance, weeks could mean the difference between an operation succeeding and an opportunity evaporating entirely. This is why London pushed so hard to maintain multiple overlapping wireless links into its major circuits wherever possible, and why the training of wireless operators was treated as a matter of the highest operational priority. Now let's talk about the human side of this, because the machines only tell half the story. The wireless operators of the SOE were, almost without exception, extraordinary people. Some were professional radio operators or amateur enthusiasts before the war, people who had grown up fascinated by the technology, who understood the physics of radio propagation the way a musician understands scales. Others came to it from completely different backgrounds and learned everything they knew during the intensive training courses at SOE schools in Scotland and the English countryside. What united them was a particular combination of qualities: precise technical skill, composure under extreme stress, the ability to work quickly in terrible conditions, and a particular kind of courage. Not the battlefield charge-forward kind, but the quiet, cold, sustained courage of someone who knows exactly what will happen if they are caught, and chooses to open the set and start transmitting anyway. Because the consequences of capture were brutal and well understood. An SOE wireless operator taken by the Gestapo or the Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, would face interrogation designed to extract three things above all: the network structure and members, the cipher systems in use, and the characteristics of that operator's personal Morse style, what the Germans called the agent's fist. The fist was as individual as a fingerprint. Every Morse operator has their own rhythm, their own timing, their own way of forming letters that is impossible to perfectly replicate. London's signals staff could often identify their operators by the feel of their transmissions alone. This is where one of the most sinister aspects of the clandestine radio war enters the story: Funkspiel, the radio game. If the Germans captured a wireless operator with their set, their cipher materials, their schedule, and their codes, they could, in theory, transmit back to London while pretending to be the captured agent. London would be deceived into thinking the circuit was still operating normally, would continue to send confirmation of planned drops, and would eventually send aircraft and supplies directly into German hands. Even worse, if agents or additional operators were being sent in to reinforce a circuit, they might be dropped right into a German reception committee. And the Germans were very good at playing this game. The two most catastrophic examples of Funkspiel in SOE history were the North Pole disaster in the Netherlands and the penetration of several F-section circuits in France. In the Dutch case, the Germans managed to maintain control of captured SOE radios for almost 2 years, from 1942 to 1944. More than 50 SOE agents were dropped into the arms of waiting German security forces. Nearly all of them died in concentration camps. The operation consumed enormous resources, misdirected intelligence, and shattered the Dutch resistance infrastructure for a critical period. In France, similar penetrations, particularly through the work of double agents and the turning of captured circuit members, led to the destruction of several major networks, most notoriously the Prosper circuit based around Paris, which collapsed in 1943 with devastating consequences for its members. These disasters led to increasingly sophisticated security protocols designed to prevent, detect, or at least signal Funkspiel situations to London. One of the most ingenious was the deliberate security check system built into the cipher protocol. Each agent before deployment was given 2 security checks, a genuine one that they would always include in their messages if transmitting freely, and a bluff one that they would include in messages if transmitting under German control. The idea was that an operator caught and forced to transmit under duress would include the bluff check, sending no genuine check, which was supposed to signal to London that something was wrong. The system was theoretically sound. In practice, it failed in several cases because London's signal staff, under pressure from operational officers desperate to maintain their circuits, sometimes explained away missing security checks as operator error rather than evidence of compromise. The institutional drive to believe that circuits were still intact, combined with the sheer workload on London's decoding and analysis staff, created conditions where warning signs were sometimes rationalized away. It was a terrible failure of process, and people died as a direct result. But the lessons were learned. painfully and expensively, and later SOE practice became significantly more rigorous about security check compliance. By the final years of the war, missing or irregular security checks were being treated with much greater suspicion, and the overall signals security culture improved substantially. Let's talk about the actual physical experience of operating a clandestine radio in occupied Europe, because it has a texture that documents, and histories often flatten. Imagine you are a wireless operator in Lyon in the autumn of 1943. You are in your mid-20s. You have been in the field for 3 months. Your cover identity is that of a commercial traveler for a textile company, and your papers are good enough to survive several routine identity checks on trains and at control points. Your set is in a leather suitcase, the kind that might plausibly contain fabric samples. The power supply is a separate unit hidden at the safe house where you operate. Run off the mains with a transformer to handle local voltage. Your transmission schedule says you should be on the air at 1400 hours on Tuesdays and Thursdays, a so-called SCEDS, scheduled contact window, during which the radio station at Grendon Underwood in Buckinghamshire will be listening on your assigned frequency. You have approximately 90 seconds of a window before the Germans' fixed station network will have a rough triangulation. You have perhaps 10 minutes before mobile units could potentially be in the area if they happen to be working this frequency today. You have been given a message to transmit by your circuit's organizer. It has been encoded using your one-time pad cipher, a series of random numbers matched against a silk-printed code sheet, the combination of which produces an encrypted letter group that is mathematically unbreakable if the pad is truly random and truly used only once. The encoded message consists of 40 letter groups. At your operating speed, transmitting in Morse, this will take approximately 8 minutes. That is too long. You need to compress the clear text further before encoding, strip every non-essential word, reduce it to the absolute minimum that still conveys the essential information. You arrive at the safe house 20 minutes before your sked. The woman who owns the flat, a widow in her 40s who lost her husband to the Germans in 1940 and has been part of the réseau ever since, lets you in without a word. You go to the back room. You take the set from its case. You plug into the mains via the transformer. You begin stringing the aerial, running the wire up through a hole in the ceiling into the roof space, where it connects to a longer wire already concealed along the inside of the eaves. You put on the headphones. You tune to your frequency. You can already hear the sounds of the ether, the crackling and whistling of atmospheric interference, other stations somewhere in the distance, fragments of Morse that might be anything. At exactly 1400 hours, you begin. You send your call sign, the brief group of letters that identifies you to Grendon. You wait a few seconds. Grendon comes back to you, strong and clear, acknowledging contact. Now you begin the message. Your hand moves almost automatically, the Morse flowing through your fingers with the ease of long practice. But your attention is not entirely on the key. Part of your mind is listening to the street outside. Part of you is tracking time. Part of you is aware of every sound in the building, and the building next door, and the street beyond. This is how experienced operators survive. Not because they're not afraid, but because fear becomes background noise that the skilled part of the mind filters out while the body keeps working. At 6 minutes, you finish the last letter group. Grendon acknowledges receipt. You send a brief sign-off group and close the contact. Total time on air, 7 minutes and 40 seconds. You disconnect the aerial from the set immediately. You don't wait, don't check anything. The aerial goes down first, because an aerial left in place is the first thing a searching German team looks for. Then the set is disconnected via Suitcase radio, conducted operations that tied down German units, cut rail lines, disrupted fuel supplies, delayed reinforcement movements, and in some cases, liberated entire departments before Allied ground forces arrived. In the weeks following D-Day in June 1944, the scale of supply operations increased dramatically. Operation Overlord's planners had always intended for the French resistance to play a major supporting role, and the coded BBC messages activated prepared sabotage plans simultaneously across France. Rail lines were cut in more than 1,000 places in the first days after the invasion. Telecommunications networks were disrupted. German convoys were ambushed, and reinforcements trying to reach Normandy found their journey slowed to a crawl by constant harassment from armed partisans who had spent months receiving training, weapons, and guidance through the SOE radio network. The wireless operators who had been sitting in attics and cellars for all those months, transmitting their schedules and requests and confirmations, had built the infrastructure that made all of this possible. Without them, Without those compact transmitter receivers and the courage required to operate them, none of it happens. In Yugoslavia, the situation was different but equally dependent on wireless communication. There, the SOE's mission evolved from supporting the royalist Chetniks under Draža Mihailović toward backing Josip Broz Tito's communist partisans, a shift driven largely by intelligence transmitted by SOE liaison officers embedded with each force. The British military mission to Tito, established in 1943, maintained contact with Cairo and later Bari through exactly the same kind of field radio systems and the consequent supply drops to the partisans, who were fighting genuine pitched battles against German and Italian forces rather than primarily engaging in low-level sabotage, were enormous in scale and decisive in effect. The German operations to destroy Tito's headquarters, the famous Seven-Axis offensives against the partisans, failed to achieve their objective partly because the partisans received timely intelligence through SOE channels and were supplied sufficiently to maintain organized resistance. In Poland, the situation presented unique difficulties of geography. Poland was far from Britain, far beyond easy aircraft range from England, and the scale of German occupation there was total and savage. The SOE's mission to Poland, conducted largely through the Polish section, working with the Polish government in exile in London, faced the additional challenge that Polish resistance was operating inside the Reich's most intensively policed eastern territories. Drop zones had to be chosen with extraordinary care. Wireless operators worked under conditions of maximum danger, and yet the communication was maintained. The Polish Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, one of the largest resistance movements in occupied Europe, depended on wireless links to London for coordination of operations, intelligence reporting, and the occasional supply drop, though Poland never received the volume of air supply that France did, partly because of distance and partly because of competing Allied strategic priorities. In Greece, in Denmark, in Norway, in Belgium, the same story repeated itself in local variations. SOE networks, their organizers, their couriers, their local helpers, but always and necessarily, at the center of any functional circuit, a wireless operator with a suitcase radio. Let's talk about the people who were lost, because they deserve to be named. Nur Inayat Khan was born in Moscow, raised in London and Paris, and trained as a nurse and children's author before the war. She volunteered for the SOE and became the first female wireless operator to be sent into occupied France. Her cover name was Madeleine. She arrived in France in June 1943, just as the Prosper circuit around Paris was beginning to collapse under German pressure. Within weeks of her arrival, most of her network had been arrested. Several people urged her to return to England while she still could. She refused. She chose to stay and keep the radio link alive, moving from safe house to safe house, transmitting under increasingly desperate conditions, because if she left, there would be no wireless communication at all from that part of France. She was eventually betrayed, probably by a French collaborator, and arrested by the Gestapo in October 1943. She was interrogated, imprisoned, escaped once, and was recaptured, and was eventually sent to Dachau, where she was executed in September 1944. She was awarded the George Cross posthumously. She was 30 years old. Yolande Beekman was born in Paris and raised in Switzerland. She became an SOE wireless operator and was dropped into France in 1943 as part of the musician circuit in northern France. She transmitted reliably for months, under very difficult conditions, before being arrested in January 1944. She was sent to Dachau and executed there on the same day as Nur Inayat Khan. Cecily Lefort was older than most agents when she was recruited, in her mid-40s, and trained as a courier rather than a wireless operator, but her circuit's operations, including the coordination of supply drops into the French Alps, were entirely dependent on the wireless communications she facilitated between her organizer and London. She was arrested in 1943 and died in Ravensbrück concentration camp in early 1945, weeks before liberation. Dennis Rake was one of the most remarkable wireless operators in F-section history, a man with a background in music hall performance who turned out to possess exactly the same fraud required to operate under pressure. He transmitted under conditions that would have paralyzed most people, once continuing to send from a building while a German identity check was in progress in the street outside. He survived the war, one of the fortunate ones. Harry Ree, codenamed Cesar, was an organizer rather than an operator, But his stockbroker circuit in eastern France was entirely dependent on wireless communication, and his ability to coordinate supply drops through his network's radio link enabled a series of sabotage operations against the Peugeot factory at Sochaux, which was being used for German tank component production. Rather than bombing the factory, which would have killed French workers and caused indiscriminate damage, Rey persuaded the Peugeot management to cooperate with his sabotage team, and the resulting internal sabotage was so effective that subsequent RAF bombing raids became unnecessary. None of this would have happened without the wireless link to London. Francis Cammertz, known as Roger, ran the jockey circuit in southern France, one of the largest and most effective resistance networks in occupied France by 1944. His circuit eventually encompassed thousands of active members across a huge geographic area and received massive quantities of supplies. He had a particular philosophy about wireless security that his operators were required to follow absolutely. Never use the same location twice in succession. Never stay on air longer than necessary. Always have an escape route planned before opening the set. His operators died at a lower rate than in many other circuits, and the survival of Jockey into the final phase of the war meant that when the Allies landed in southern France in August 1944, Operation Dragoon, there was an established, armed, coordinated resistance ready to support them. These people, the organizers, the operators, the couriers, the local helpers who sheltered them and asked nothing in return except the chance to fight back, they are the human fabric behind what might otherwise be discussed purely in terms of technology and logistics. Let's go deeper into the technical evolution of the radio equipment itself, because it continued to develop throughout the war in response to operational experience. The early sets sent into the field had various shortcomings that became apparent only through hard use. Frequency stability was a persistent problem. Early transmitters could drift in frequency during a transmission session, making it difficult for the receiving station to maintain good contact and potentially making the signal more detectable to German monitoring equipment that was tuned to specific frequencies. The solution involved improvements to the oscillator circuits and, in later models, the use of crystal-controlled frequency selection, where the operating frequency was determined by the physical resonance of a quartz crystal rather than the tuning of a variable component. Crystal control gave much more precise and stable frequencies, which was a significant operational advantage. The coding systems also evolved in parallel with the radio equipment. The early SOE agents used poem codes, where a poem known to both the agent and London was used as the basis for a transposition cipher. The poem was usually one the agent had memorized, often something they personally valued, which had the advantage that it existed only in the agent's memory and couldn't be found in a search. But poem codes had a significant vulnerability. Given enough encrypted traffic, a skilled cryptanalyst could break them without knowing the underlying poem. And the German cryptanalysis services, though never able to break the one-time pad cipher, had demonstrated an ability to work on poem-encoded traffic. Leo Marx, the extraordinary young head of SOE's code section, argued forcefully and eventually successfully for the replacement of poem codes with one-time pads printed on silk, which could be cut into individual pads for each message and destroyed immediately after use. The mathematical properties of the one-time pad, when properly used, make it provably unbreakable, a fact that Marx understood clearly and that he eventually succeeded in persuading the SOE's operational leadership to take seriously. The transition to silk pads significantly improved the security of field communications and removed one of the most serious cryptographic vulnerabilities that had made some circuits susceptible to German exploitation. The silk printing itself was a minor technological marvel of the clandestine world. The one-time pad grids were printed on thin silk fabric because silk is silent, unlike paper, and doesn't disintegrate if it gets wet. It can be sewn into clothing, hidden in waistband linings, rolled up and concealed inside innocuous objects, and if necessary swallowed, slowly and with difficulty, but without immediate physical harm, as a way of destroying cryptographic material if capture appeared imminent. Training in the use of these materials took place at various SOE training establishments scattered across Scotland and England, the same places where agents learned parachuting, weapons handling, silent killing, lock-picking, and the vast array of other dark arts required for clandestine work. The wireless training section was one of the most intensive, precisely because the combination of skills required, technical, physical, psychological, was so demanding and so difficult to compress into the training time available. The training establishment at Tame Park in Oxfordshire became one of the primary centers for wireless operator training. Students there would spend weeks learning Morse, building up their speed through daily practice sessions in which they would copy transmitted test messages and then be assessed on accuracy and speed. Simultaneously, they learned the mechanics of the sets themselves, how to tune, how to troubleshoot common faults, how to improvise repairs with limited materials, how to set up an aerial in difficult circumstances. They also practiced the operational security disciplines, how to choose a transmission site, how to limit time on air, how to depart a site securely, how to behave if challenged while carrying the set. The best training came from people who had actually been in the field. By the middle years of the war, a number of returned agents and operators contributed to the training programs, sharing the kinds of practical knowledge that could only come from experience. What does it feel like when you think a DF van is in the area? How do you make a decision to break off contact early when the transmission isn't finished? How do you rebuild your nerve after a narrow escape and go back to transmitting the next week? These were questions that no textbook could fully answer, but that veterans could begin to address from their own hard experience. There is another dimension to the wireless operations story that deserves attention, and that is the experience at the receiving end, at the listening stations in England. Grendon Underwood in Buckinghamshire was the principal receiving station for SOE's F-section traffic from France. It was staffed largely by women of the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, the FANYs, who listened through headphones to the frequencies assigned to their circuits, waiting for the distinctive call signs that indicated a field operator was coming up on air. The work required sustained concentration of a particularly demanding kind, sitting for hours in a slightly dim room full of the crackling interference of the HF bands, listening for faint signals that might rise out of the noise at any moment, knowing that on the other end of that link there might be someone transmitting under conditions of mortal danger. The Fanny operators at Grendon developed a deep, though entirely radio-mediated familiarity with the operators in the field. They learned their fists, their rhythms, their habits. They knew which operators were fast, which ones tended to make particular kinds of errors when under pressure, which ones had a characteristic way of starting their call sign or signing off. This knowledge was operationally significant, because it was one of the ways in which Grendon could detect if a familiar operator's style had suddenly changed, which was one possible indication of a Funkspiel situation. The Fanny listeners also developed the ability to receive effectively in extremely difficult signal conditions. Field operators were often transmitting with low power from locations where the aerial was far from ideal, and the resulting signal might be very weak, buried in static and interference. Skilled receiving operators could extract readable Morse from signals that would be incomprehensible to a less experienced listener, and this ability to maintain contact in marginal conditions was itself operationally significant. The decoded traffic from Grendon would be processed and passed to the relevant country sections at Baker Street, and to the air operations section, where it would be used to plan and authorize supply drops. The turnaround time from a field request to a confirmed drop date could be as little as a few days when everything worked smoothly, or as long as several weeks when aircraft were unavailable, weather was bad, or other operations had priority. Agents in the field sometimes felt that London was slow or unresponsive to their requests, a perception that generated real tension, and Baker Street sometimes felt that circuits were demanding more than could possibly be delivered, which generated tension in the other direction. But through all of it, the radio link was the thing that kept the relationship alive. There were also stories of remarkable technical improvisation in the field that illustrate the resilience and ingenuity of the people involved. Sets were damaged in parachute landings and repaired with locally scavenged components. Power supplies failed and were replaced with improvised alternatives. Aerials were fashioned from unexpected materials, wire stripped from motors or fencing, or even bicycle spokes lashed together. One operator, faced with a burned-out oscillator crystal with no replacement available, managed to locate a watch repairer who had a stock of quartz crystals intended for clock movements, and found one that by chance resonated at a frequency close enough to their assigned band to allow communication to be restored. These improvisations kept circuits alive at moments when they might otherwise have gone dark, and keeping the circuit alive was not just a matter of operational continuity, it was a matter of the survival of the people involved, because a circuit that lost contact with London lost access to the resources, warnings, and support that London could provide. It became vulnerable in ways that could not be compensated for by any amount of local courage. There is one more thread to pull on here, and it concerns the relationship between the wireless communication network and intelligence, as opposed to supply operations. Because those suitcase radios were not merely logistics tools, they were intelligence instruments. The agents in the field were uniquely positioned to observe German military activity. Train movements, troop concentrations, the location of particular headquarters, the movement of particular units, the state of German morale, the effectiveness of Allied bombing on specific industrial targets, all of this was intelligence of the highest value, and all of it could be transmitted back to London.